sugar or soy crops, and I want to characterize the gap, if it exists, through economic analysis. This project was the culmination of multiple years serving as Professor David Zilberman's research assistant. He is one of the foremost scholars advancing research around the circular bioeconomy, and my work is largely based on the foundation of knowledge that I've accrued under his direction. So the circular bioeconomy is the main framework through which I conducted my research, and it's a newer discipline rising in popularity as policymakers, economists, and academics alike are seeking to answer the big question of how we can transition our economy away from fossil fuels. And it can be defined as maximizing the value of biological materials while minimizing waste through leveraging residue resources and utilizing agriculture to produce more than food, but also fuel, fiber, fine chemicals, and pharmaceuticals, and more. And in doing so, it can also close loops in the supply chain. But this takes utilizing what are called renewable carbon resources, described in the 2023 billion ton report released by the Department of Energy, as usable carbons that can be converted into useful materials, which falls under the definition of the bioeconomy. And expanding this potential and harnessing existing sources of renewable carbons could enhance the US's energy security by lessening our dependence on foreign sources of energy and helping transition our economy away from fossil fuels, which is a critical, if not the critical existential challenge facing humanity. So why second generation biofuels? There are two main kinds, first and second, first being made from crops grown to become biofuels, and for the sake of this thesis, I was primarily interested in corn, sugarcane, and soy, and these are simple starches that can be easily fermented into ethanol, versus second generation biofuels, which are made from various forms of residues or non-food crops to produce ethanol through a process called cellulosic ethanol production, or into biodiesel. And they include things like corn stover, rice millet, wheat straw, to name a few, so you can kind of think of what is left behind on the field after harvest occurs. And because these are waste residues that can be converted into new products to extend the life and the value of these carbon resources, they fit seamlessly into the concept of a circular bioeconomy. And I focused on crops that produce ethanol for this project because of the logical relationship between agricultural residues and their associated virginal crops, and also because it narrowed and honed in the focus of my studies. And I think that second generation fuels are especially interesting and important because of the environmental and social issues that are associated with expanding the production of monocultures. Corn, soy, the suite of fertilizers, chemicals, potential threats to biodiversity that come with that. But their cellulosic nature means they contain high amounts of lignin, which is expensive to process and requires relatively more energy than first generation fuels. So in my paper, I explore the complete social cost of second generation fuels, including their carbon cost from energy use, compared to first generation when I'm making policy recommendations for its expansion. And in fact, second generation fuels only comprise about 35% of the biofuels produced in the US, and a mere 1% of the biofuels produced worldwide. So expanding their production could be a tactic in combating the climate crisis, which is why I chose to study this topic and why I chose the questions I did, which leads to my next slide. And with this theoretical background established, I sought to answer a threefold set of questions through my textual analysis and econometrics. Where is there a gap between existing and potential capacity for the production of second generation biofuels? What are the underlying socio-political economic factors causing this gap? And does production predict capacity? Why or why not? I predicted that it would be unlikely for there to be a gap between existing and potential capacity, meaning that biofuel refineries that process residues are going to be located in regions that already have high levels of residue production. But if there are gaps, I was expecting them to potentially be in regions with a high democratic vote share, but a lower median household income, as these are the socio-political factors I was testing my data against. And these are sometimes contradictory or contrasting factors across counties, but I was anticipating that democratic regions would be more likely to have the community support to build somewhat more sustainable fuel processing facilities. But that being said, fuel processing facilities in any capacity are oftentimes located in counties that have lower median household incomes, which is a well-studied environmental justice issue. So ultimately, I'll be able to answer if production of residues predicts capacity of energy and why. This question has not yet been addressed in the literature, and I had to build a novel data set to base my analysis off of, because no such data set existed before this project. So how did I go about tackling these questions? The brunt of the coding I did was building my data set through which I was able to learn how to do web scraping, cleaning data sources that have over 100,000 rows, and how to spend 3 hours trying to fix your code only to go back to it the next day and realize it actually only takes 10 minutes. And I combined data from a variety of sources, creating a final data set showing me, in summary, the variation between production and existing energy capacity in British thermal units in what is produced on the field and the production capacity of biorefineries that can process cellulosic fiber and residues to produce more second-generation fuel, all organized based on county FIPS code and filtered based on economic scenario as outlined in the Billion Ton Report. And my data set also displayed the Democratic vote share in the 2022 Senate election at the county level and median household income per county. But this doesn't include all my methods. I also interviewed Ellen Bruno from UC Cooperative Extension and Jared Dixon from Conservation Farms and Ranches to inform my research from the perspective of within the farm gate, as well as other farmers and seeking support in my data work from Berkeley's D-Lab. So using the data set I made, I produced these two graphs featured on the slide, which can reveal a few things to us off the bat. First, we can see on the left, the graph displays a histogram of the gap between energy that could be harnessed from the residues that are currently being produced and versus how much energy we are currently harvesting from that residue. And as you can see, it follows a very roughly normal distribution that is clearly concentrated around 0, and at 0 that means there is no gap between capacity in production and existing capacity from biorefineries, and it looks like about 80% of the data is concentrated here. However, we can also see that about 10 to 20% of the data sits on the right side of the graph, meaning in those regions, there's energy being left on the field that could be harnessed. And what I found from my analysis is that oftentimes these regions are occurring in counties that are of low median income, meaning that these counties are being underserved, and the expansion of second-generation biofuel production could provide opportunities for economic development, which is a core tenet of the circular bioeconomy and the unique opportunities it provides in this area. And on the right, we have a scatter plot showing existing versus potential energy capacity in the near-term economic scenario, with blue dots showing the points summary binned in R with outliers removed, and my regression line is fitted to these points. What we can see is that there is a positive relationship between the production and processing of energy, clustered around 0 like we expected, but there's still a lot of variation and a gap, which means we're moving in the right direction or on the right track, but it's obviously not yet perfect. So we understand there's a gap and some variance, but what explains this? Is it random, or is there some underlying political, social, economic factor causing it? So going back to my questions, yes, production does typically predict capacity, but there's a bigger gap than I initially anticipated. So I tested my data against the 2022 Senate election results at the county level, specifically Democratic vote share, to see if that had an impact on biorefineries that can process residues being placed in regions and where these residues are. And I found that being from a Democratic region did have an effect on if there was a gap. Testing is significant between a p-value of 1 and 5%. So is this gap random? Preliminary correlations say no. There is a correlation between Senate vote and there being refineries, and other economic variables seem to matter. But my multiple R-squared is still low, which I anticipated because I need to include more variables and fixed effects for counties in my data set. It's not out of the ordinary when you're making a data set at the scale of the entire United States and you're also an undergrad. So looking forward, I have multiple ideas for how I'm going to continue working on this project after the semester ends, especially regarding the data analysis component to answer more questions my thesis brought up for me, like the unintended consequences of more fertilizer use when residues are taken off the land as opposed to being left with fallow, as an example. And scaling back, we are mostly on track with our production of second-generation biofuels. Social, economic factors seem to have an effect, but we do need to think about the full carbon and environmental impact of the expansion of biofuel production for the future. There is a ton to dig into, and I do believe my thesis helped inch along this great big issue, but there is still much to be done to understand how we can transition away from fossil fuels to combat the climate crisis. And I want to thank you for your time and attention, and thanks to my incredible advisor, UN, for her continuous patience, guidance, and support through the whole process, because it would not have been even close to possible without her and her help. Thank you.
Questions from